Jill Shively testified to a grand jury that O.J. Simpson almost hit her car with his Ford Bronco just after the time that Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman were murdered.
Our first analysis of American Manhunt spurned these three troubling questions. Number one, why wasn't Jill Shively called as a witness? Number two, how did O.J.'s defense explain the other glove, the one soaked in the blood of the victims and mixed with O.J.'s blood at Rockingham? And three, why wasn't other evidence collected, the knife box, the wet laundry, the medical supplies? In this analysis, we'll deal with the first of these questions. Why wasn't Jill Shively called as a witness?
She never testified during the trial because prosecutors pulled her as a witness when they learned she sold her interview to a television tabloid show, hard copy.
That's the short version, that Jill Shively testified before a grand jury. She was actually a strong grand jury witness, but then when Marsha Clark found out that she'd sold her story, then she pulled her as a witness. But there's actually a lot more to it than that.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science. Now this is actually a very interesting question. When you have all the information, what would you do in this case? Now, when you deal with this question, why wasn't Jill Shively called as a witness? There's not actually just one answer. It wasn't just that she sold her story to hard copy. There were also potential issues surrounding her credibility. According to People, Jill Shively was getting over the flu on the night of June 12th, 1994. That's the night of the murder, and she needed to get food in her stomach. Shively says she left her Santa Monica apartment before 11 p.m. to drive to the Westwood Home Market in nearby Brentwood, trying to get there before it closed. Driving east on San Vicente Boulevard towards Bundy Drive, less than half a mile from where Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman had been murdered, Shively nearly struck a white Bronco with no headlights on. That's also quite interesting, which had driven onto the median in order to avoid hitting another car in the intersection. But Shively's testimony, which could have put Simpson near the scene around the time of the murders, was never heard in court.
Jill, what a great witness you would have been. I know there's some people believe your story, some people don't. You offered to not take the money from hard copy when there was an objection to it, and you have since, as I understand it, turned down quite a lot of money to appear elsewhere. Is that right?
Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. If you find this analysis worthwhile and you want me to continue with this series on OJ, please let me know in the comments. You can also hit the thanks button and let's get started. Now, I do think the fact that Jill Shively didn't take the money counts in her favor, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's correct. At the time when they called me in about the money, I hadn't taken it, and I said, well, I'll turn it down. I don't have to take the money, and other prosecutors were supportive of that, and I had a big to-do with Marsha Clark about it. And
now, doesn't that sound as though Jill Shively ultimately did take the money? And, you know, it's not to say Shively didn't initially impress Clark as a witness. At least she did in the beginning. According to the Hollywood Reporter, in Clark's 1997 book, Without a Doubt, the great title, by the way, the former prosecutor recalls that Shively first struck her, quote, as like a real gem. She was dressed neatly and conservatively for her testimony. She was articulate. She was confident. In fact, Scott Gordon, one of my fellow DAs, knew her because their children went to the same school. So Marsha Clark felt that Jill was credible in terms of her first impression.
Made it worse, and and since then I've turned down over $100,000
to appear in other shows,
to do other shows, the tabloids. It was like a feeding frenzy, and I haven't worked for a long time, and I could have used it, but I felt it was blood money. I made a mistake, and I didn't know at the time what was going on, and I regret that. That's the only thing I regret, right?
She sounds pretty good, right? OJ was all set up to receive his comeuppance, and then kind of inexplicably, everything sort of went pear-shaped. And I want you to ask yourself, if you were a prosecutor in this situation, under pressure, would you have called Jill Shively? I mean, given the additional gobsmacking, mind-numbing, gaslighting context I'm about to share with you. So according to the Hollywood Reporter, the hard copy fiasco unfolded about a week after Shively's first appearance before a grand jury. By all accounts, a successful day of testimony for the prosecution. And then something strange happened. A producer cold called Shively at home and assured her that other witnesses like Kato Kalin, Jose Camacho, that's the person who sold Simpson a 15-inch knife, and that later turned out not to have been the murder weapon, they were doing these interviews as well and taking payment. So Shively felt, well, I guess I could do the same thing. And so within minutes of Shively agreeing to this, and she thought, I might make a little bit of extra money, maybe go on vacation. She did have a small child with her. A van was at her home to transport her to the studio. And then the interview aired that evening. It all happened pretty quickly. And then Clark describes the aftermath to all of that. Clark writes, the next morning, I'd barely stepped out of the elevator on the 18th floor when reporters began asking me whether I'd seen the tabloid TV show Hard Copy the night before. The news sent me reeling. And so it obviously seems to imply that she hadn't seen it and she was caught unaware. She was wrong-footed. Probably couldn't have been a very nice feeling. So I think the media had a huge role in undermining the idea of putting Shively on the stand, right? But then things got worse. Again, back to the Hollywood Reporter. On my desk was a fax from a television actor named Brian Patrick Clark. By the way, that is Clark with an E at the end, no relation to Marsha Clark. But if your brain starts to get mixed up from this point on, I don't blame you. Back to the Hollywood Reporter. Clark with an E was claiming to have lost money to Shively and considered her a consummate liar. According to Clark, that's Clark without the E, the actor claimed, now that's Clark with the E, that Shively had presented him with a screenplay she had written and that a production company was about to buy it for $250,000, $250,000, and wanted Clark, that's the actor with an E, to star in it. And so Clark with an E alleged that Shively had talked into lending her $6,000. The actor later learned that the script wasn't Shively's, writes Clark. That's Clark without the E. It was the screenplay for a film in pre-production titled My Life, which starred Michael Keaton and Nicole Kidman. Whoopsie. Clark continues, we'd been duped. We had no choice but to cut Shively loose. And Clark without the E characterizes Shively's Simpson story as an outright lie. Pretty strong words. Well, not so fast. Clark with an E had possibly been duped. Did that mean Shively didn't see OJ? If you think about it, Shively provides a script that sounds really good for this court case. Is it really good or is it too good to be true? And I think one thing you can think about is if the Broncos headlights weren't on and he went up on the median and there were other cars there, bear in mind, Shively said that the Bronco almost crashed into another car, right? Then why are there no other witnesses to that particular interaction? Why aren't there other drivers that came forward? And here's where things get complicated. Let's go back to the Hollywood Reporter. Shively's version, that's on Clark with an E, is very different. She claims that Clark with an E was a softball buddy of Simpson's who didn't want to see his pal go to prison. He made up things to discredit me, Shively says. Shively does acknowledge a legal dispute with Clark with an E, whom she'd met while visiting some friends on the former MGM lot over credit card debt. So there does seem to be a real connection between herself and Clark with an E, but also quite a lot of love lost between the two. And so she says, I had friends on the show Dallas, and he was on 8 is Enough, Shively says now. We settled out of court and can't talk about it.
Why have you chosen to appear here, Jill?
Well, one thing I want to say real quick, I want to correct you on your time. You had said 10:45.
Yes.
And it's 10:50, and if I say 10:45 now, then I'll really get in more trouble. Every little thing I say,
okay,
or that's why I wanted to correct. It was 10:50 I saw OJ.
And tell us about that Sunday night. Where were you? You were coming from your home?
So the whole thing is kind of iffy, and it does make one wonder, couldn't Clark, that's Clark without the E, just have rolled the dice and let the jury decide. Just let the jury hear this woman and they can decide if they believe her. I mean, where we are now, what did Marsha Clark have to lose? Except, of course, she didn't know that when, she didn't know then that she was going to lose the case. Going back to the Hollywood Reporter, Jeffrey Toobin, the New Yorker legal reporter who wrote the book on which the FX series was based, he spent a lot of time with Shively during his reporting, and he also says he is undecided. He can't decide whether Jill Shively is telling the truth or not. But he does say this: if her testimony is true, it would have been devastating to Simpson. And that's why so much sort of rides on this, right? But I must say, I'm also a little undecided. He goes on to say, from a litigation point of view, the fact that she took money from a tabloid is problematic, but that doesn't mean her story was false by any means.
That doesn't mean I'm wrong.
Honestly, it may. It might.
And that's the problem.
I was coming from my home. I had dropped my daughter off at my mother's, and I'd had the flu all day, and I was hungry, and I thought at the time this market, Westward Ho, closed at 11, so I left my home at 10:45. And at the intersection of San Vicente and Bundy is where I almost collided with O.J. Simpson's Bronco.
Mm-hmm. And when you first almost had the collision, the cars all stopped. There was another car involved as well, right, Jill?
There was a third car going west on San Vicente, and it also stopped to avoid being hit by O.J. Simpson's car, which had gone up into the median.
Mm-hmm.
And,
so the Bronco went up on the median and stopped.
It had to stop because it was blocked by the other car. And then they jostled with moving each other's car out of the way so OJ's car could go. And at that time, his lights were off. And I recognized him. First I told Marsha Clark I thought it was Marcus Allen, but then I realized it was O.J. Simpson because I recognized his voice yelling at the car. And he had also given me this look like, what are you doing here? And I thought he was drunk at that time, and I had memorized the license. I looked at the license plate number, and I said, well, it's either 3CWZ788 or 3CZW788, and I had turned it in the next morning, reporting him as a drunk driver.
Oh, you did?
Yeah, I did.
Without knowing anything about the murders?
I knew nothing at 7 a.m. in the morning. I had to be at work at 6. I knew nothing about the murders. I knew nothing what was going on.
And you there's a record of you turning in that license plate the next morning?
They have a report. They have a police report.
Interestingly, Shively, although she thinks Simpson is guilty now, she wasn't convinced of it in 1994. And that didn't sit very well with Clark at the time, who said, she said, I got to the DA's office, I heard Marsha yelling at someone, and then she said, do you think OJ is guilty? And she said, I don't know. And she said, well, what do you think happened? She said, well, he could have gone there, saw what happened, and was trying to get out of there, and maybe that's why he was in a hurry to leave. And Marsha said, don't say that. I was like, then why did you ask me? Shively was beginning to feel like I wasn't protected, like I was the enemy. So what do you think? Would you have put Jill Shively on the stand? Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.